Hello and welcome to the Modern Homesteading Podcast. This is your host, Rachel Jameson. Today I am honored to have my guest, Nigel Palmer, with me. He is the author of the Regenerative Grower's Guide to Garden Amendments, using locally sourced materials to make mineral and biological extracts and ferments. But he also has some other things. And so I wanted you, Nigel, to introduce yourself and kind of tell the listeners, how did you get here?
Oh, okay. Well, thank you for inviting me onto your program, Rachel. It's a pleasure to be here and to speak with you and your audience. Let's see. I've been a gardener for my whole life. I've started gardening when I was in my 20s, and my family had a garden before that. And gardening was just always something fun to do. And back then, we tilled the ground, added cow manure, and tilled it in, and we grew some really amazing stuff. As I had a family and we grew up together, my wife and I, and had children, we still maintained a garden. And we thought it was really important to show the children where food came from. And they each got a little plot of the garden and made mud pies and all the things kids do in soil. And when we were in our 30s, maybe our 40s, we recognized that growing our own food was the best healthcare program in the United States, because our food supply continued to degrade with pesticides, herbicides, GMOs, and some of the other toxic chemicals and processes that most of our food has in it. And so we started growing food more for our own health. And we grow a year's supply of garlic, a year's supply of blueberries, a year's supply of potatoes and herbs, and on it went. And while we were doing this, being one that never bought anything in a store to put on a garden, again, it was rototill and cow manure was about the only thing that I ever added. I recognized that in order to have healthy food, you needed to have healthy soil. And this brought about the idea of homemade mineral and biological amendments. And I started looking for sources of these kinds of things, mostly in the history of indigenous people, as indigenous people have been growing these things for thousands of years on the same soil, and somehow they managed to grow healthy food. And the first thing was taking weeds and putting them in a bucket of water and letting them rot. Then after about 2 weeks, the bucket smelled god awful, but the plants didn't seem to mind. And that was really the beginning of the process. Korean natural farming ideas were instrumental in a lot of these recipes that are in my book and that people use. And as I started looking around, I found that many people were doing different versions of these ideas, and I started collecting them. I was teaching at the time at my wife's school, the Institute of Sustainable Nutrition, and I taught the garden portion of her program, which is a holistic view of human health, and recognizing that it starts in the soil and it's the food and then the preparation and storing and all that of food. And after doing that for some time, I realized that I had amassed a lot of information, and realized that it was so hard to find this information. It was really important to put together a document that others could use, a toolbox of ideas, if you will, that somebody could pick up and manage to figure out themselves how to do these things. And so that's what my book is all about. It's a toolbox of ideas, and it's dense. There's a lot of information in there. There's a lot of data in there. And the idea is for it to be used as a reference for people to grow high quality food using the materials around their backyard as resources for both biology and minerals in that process.
I love that whole, everything you just said there. I love so much. Now you have a science background, correct? Which helped you understand all of this a little bit better.
I do. I have a couple degrees in engineering, and I was an aerospace engineer for 36 years. And my job was solving complex airplane problems. So yeah, I have a pretty good science background.
Brains that does this well. That's great. So you've been doing this all these years, um, you're making with this, you're doing DIY amendments, and you mentioned Korean natural farming. I have done a little studying into it and heard about it. Can you explain a little bit about that for the
Yeah.
listeners?
So I first found a book in, I don't know, 2010 or 11, a book on Korean natural farming by Master Cho. And I'm not sure, but it might be one of the first books that he put in. And it was an English translation.
Okay.
The translation wasn't very good, but it gave the basis and understanding of making fermented plant juice, of making IMO 1, 2, 3, and 4, which is an indigenous microorganism, basically harnessing the biology in your backyard, and using that for digesting plants into forms that could be shelf stable and used to feed plants going forward. Also vinegar extractions, and there were a bunch of other ideas in there. And they really advanced my rotting weeds in a bucket to something a little bit more sophisticated, and actually being able to put together product that I had then analyzed. Of course, having that engineering background, I wanted to know what was in these things. And we're taught, if you read the work of William Albrecht and Carrie Reams and people like that, you'll read that there are 18, well, the number goes up every year as science learns more about the intricacies of the plant-soil relationship. But there are reported to be 18 minerals that plants need in order to survive, in order to be really healthy, I should say. And it's no coincidence that we need these minerals as well. And so I started doing analysis on the fermented plant juices and vinegar extractions that I was making. And many of that data is also included in my book. It's also included in my website as well. But what I found was all 18 minerals of these amendments, all 18 minerals were in them. They were there. And then it suddenly realized, oh, this is why we eat apples, because they have all of these minerals in them. This is why we eat blueberries. This is why we eat these vegetables, is because all of these minerals are in there. And the next thing I realized, that when I compared the analysis of a fermented plant juice of stinging nettle, for instance, to that of anything that you go on a storefront and look at I challenge anybody to look at the ingredients on a bottle of whatever they think they're buying and that's going to do good, and compare it to the analysis that I've done on some of these products you can make at home for free. And you'll realize that the products you make for free have all of the minerals in them, where the products that you buy in the store generally don't. And also, they're in plant available forms. They're already been digested and have these minerals in forms that plants can use directly. They're water soluble. And then the next thing is recognizing that we're using dilution rates of 500 to 1. So that 1 quart of fermented stinging nettle that you make is really 125 gallons of amendments. So very quickly.
Things I was going to ask. Yeah, how much? So you don't need to make a lot.
You don't need them, especially if you're a backyard gardener. You can make a quart of this stuff, and it's going to last for a long time, and it's going to work, and it's plant available, and it has all 18 minerals in them. And so all of a sudden, it became so intuitively obvious that these ideas were very important and and well worth pursuing, not only for your own health, but also for your pocketbook, and also for the health of the planet. We talk about regenerative growing. We talk about sustainable growing. And when you start breaking those words down, you recognize, in order to be sustainable, then you better not be using products for processing, for transportation, for packaging. All of those things are not sustainable. And so when you start making your own products in your backyard using what otherwise would be waste products in your backyard, closing waste gaps, these ideas quickly become intuitively obvious.
So what are some of you said using simple tools. What are some of the tools that you're using and that are simple, that pretty much if you're a homesteader or a gardener, you probably have?
Well, so if I'm going to make a vinegar extraction, the first thing I need is vinegar. Well, that's kind of in most people's cabinets, especially a homesteader. You can also make your own vinegar if you have any.
Ask you. Does it have to be a
Yeah, that's
specific acidity? Because I do make apple cider vinegar. I make apple scrap vinegar. Is there a specific acidity or no? That's getting too
well.
complicated.
The answer is yeah. The answer is yes. Vinegars are generally like the 3 to 5 pH range, 4, and it depends on how you make it and things like that. And so yeah, you're looking for something acidic, and you're using that acidity to break down eggshells, cow bones, oyster shells, shrimp shells, whatever it might be. And so the answer is yes. And so you can make that at home for free. And that was the other reason that I started writing this book is recognize, or actually doing stuff on my YouTube channel, was recognizing that people. So I have I speak to people all over the world about these subjects, and there's some people from some parts of the world that says, "Well, Nigel, we don't have apple cider vinegar here." And I said, "Well, what fruits do you have?" And it turns out they're fruit growers, and they've got all kinds of fruit. Well, you can make any kind of bad wine from just about anything, and there's your vinegar. And so all of a sudden, you have the ability to make some of these products for extremely low cost free, especially if you're making it yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And they're so easy. When we talk about kitchen tools, okay, let's get your hats on here. This is going to scare the heck out of anybody. You need a glass jar. You need a sieve. You may need a scale, but you can make a balance if you don't have a scale. And that's about it.
Perfect. That to me is revolutionary because so many people don't want to get into homesteading or gardening because they say it's more expensive than just buying from the store. Now, I think
And
that's a myth, and you know that that's not fact, but it's nice to hear you say this is really all you need and some knowledge, which you have a great YouTube channel. Your book is really helpful. So, what are you using as far as plants? Like I heard you say nettles, obviously apples, which could be any fruit. I love nettles. It's one of my favorite weeds. We use it a lot just for teas and stuff for teas and stuff like that.
yeah.
Is that something that you have to, like, what would you use and could any green be used in replacement of that? I think nettles are an amazing medicinal plant, but I'm sure there's, if you don't live where those grow. And could you use them? The other question I had was, could you use the herbs dried? Or do you need them
Yeah.
fresh?
No, you want it so to make a fermented plant juice, you're just using the plant and the sugar, and so you're actually leaching the moisture out of the plant. So no, you don't want to use dried. You want to use something you pick early in the morning, and if you pick it like a week before a full moon, that'll make a big difference because the soil and the water in the soil and the plant is affected by lunar cycles just like the ocean is. And so as the tides rise and fall, that's exactly what's going on in the soil as well. So by harvesting plants before the full moon, when the water in the soil is rising up as well, you'll get more moisture in your fermented plant juice. The next thing is, I think you asked about what kinds of plants. And this brings up a conversation of weeds, which is a really fun conversation. In fact, I just published an article in Acres USA magazine this week, this month, the March, and it's an article about weeds. But anyway, the short answer on weeds is weeds grow in soils that are deficient somehow. And so you can use the weeds that are growing in your garden as an indicator of what your garden needs. This is nature's way of revitalizing the soil. And so I'll use an example of quackgrass. Quackgrass is the bane of many farmers and gardeners in their garden. And of course, I had quackgrass as well. So while I was pulling it out and it snapped because my soil was so dense, I live above 1,000 feet, and my soil is essentially glacial moraine. So it's been there for 10,000 years, and it hasn't had a whole lot done to it since then, except get rained on. And so it's really dense stuff. And so I'd pull the quackgrass and it would snap and I'd go and stuff like that. And then one day when I was doing it, I thought, well, this is nature's way of revitalizing the soil by the weeds that grow here. And so I took the quackgrass and I made a fermented plant juice out of it. And then I did analysis on it. And you can see that in my book. You can actually see this analysis. And I was amazed to find all 18 of the minerals that my needs in there. And of course, quackgrass has these beautiful long runners that make the roots all over the place. So now we recognize that the photosynthesis energy that plants make is how we make topsoil. This is the organic matter. This is the carbon that's actually being released into the soil, making the long-term and short-term organic matters that are required for healthy soils. And so, ding, the light bulb went on. And so now I never take anything out of my garden. No weeds leave my garden at all. This is nature's way of revitalizing. So all of that carbon, I'll make a small compost pile next to my cultivars, but I'll never take any of the plant material out of the garden. And I'll always leave the roots in the garden as much as I can as well, because that's providing organic matter deep into the soil. And so by using the weeds as indicators and sources of minerals, this kind of turns this mindset on its head of don't eliminate these things, utilize them and understand what they're doing. And what you'll find is the soil will change and the weeds that grow in your garden will change. Some of the weeds in my garden are things like garlic, cilantro, dill, kale, collards, dandelions, docks, clovers, violets. You get the picture. Mm-hmm. And so what I do is those weeds, I want these plants in my garden because they make great cover crops in the spring before I have time to actually get my tomatoes into the ground. And the way I control them is by not letting them or letting them go to seed. If I don't want them, I don't let them go to seed. If I want them, I let them go to seed. And what happens is your soil begins to change. Now, I haven't eliminated the quackgrass in my garden, but when I pull quackgrass out of my garden now, those roots, they just come right up because the soil has begun to change. And when those roots and those runners come up of that quackgrass in the garden, I don't throw that out of my garden. I leave that on the surface of the garden to break down as a mulch. And so I'm working with nature rather than working against her by using this organic matter, using this carbon to keep it in the ground, to keep it in the garden, to feed the active layer, the biology on the top of the soil, as well as to create the humic structures down below, deep in the soil, which are required for soil tilth and water retention, air circulation, and increasing the exchange capacity of the soil, the ability of the soil to actually hold on to minerals throughout the growing season.
That makes so much sense. And it's really sad that, I've been a person that does this where I remove the weeds from my garden and put them in a compost pile, and it eventually gets back on there. But I like what you're doing better. It just seems much easier, so much less complicated than.
When you take those weeds and you put them on the compost piles, mineralization occurs, which you lose significant amounts of that carbon into the air as carbon dioxide. How many of us make this compost pile this big? And then we come back a year later and it's this big. We've lost 2/3, half of the amount. That's a loss of carbon into the atmosphere. Now you're just going to get those humic substances that you're looking for in that compost pile, which is really important. And it's a very good tool and all the rest of that. But if I had let that digest in my garden, then that carbon would feed the soil biology. I'd still lose some carbon into the atmosphere too, but I'd be feeding that active layer. And this is something that a lot of people don't understand, is the need to have carbon in the soil to feed the biology in the soil. We need a thriving biological community in the soil. So when our soil's bare, that means it dries out and there's no moisture. The biology can't survive. The next thing the biology needs is carbon. It needs food. And that's this active layer of carbon that we're putting on, the crushed leaves, the mulches, the weeds, all the things we're talking about. This is what's feeding the active layer of the soil that feeds the biology that's doing a lot of the work, that's all fed by the plant through photosynthesis, by the way, if we make that full loop. And so important. But so we need to recognize that in our garden space, we need both kinds of carbon. We need both sorts of organic matter. The active organic matter that's actually feeding the soil biology, as well as the stable organic matter that's forming the humic substances down below, that's giving us water retention, exchange capacity, tilth, air exchange, places for the biology to hide, and most importantly, and this is something that is maybe or may not be beyond the scope of this conversation, the voltage, the actual electrical potential in the soil that drives the whole shooting match.
Oh, wow. I could go down a rabbit hole with that and ask you questions. But maybe we'll stay on compost for a minute and maybe we'll come back to that. We'll see how much time we have. So with the compost, do you do a compost pile then, or do you strictly make your amendments on your soil?
So that's a really great question. Most of our soils are in such bad shape that we need to do as much as we possibly can in order to try to bring them back into a healthy state. And so the answer to the question is you need to do all of the above. So the answer is yes, make a compost pile annually. My compost has a 3-year cycle. I make it 1 year, I let it sit for a year, and I use it the 3rd year. So I have 3 compost piles going at all times.
Okay.
I've never been able to grow enough compost. Never. Yeah. Just because my soil is just so terrible, and I recognize the need to get this organic matter into the soil. The next thing I'd want to suggest is there's been some studies recently by some folks in Australia, and what's really, so let me back up. What's really amazing about compost is that when you look at the elemental structure of compost, doesn't matter where in the world it's made, it doesn't matter what materials it's used, the humic structure, the stable organic matter, all seems to have very similar proportions of minerals. Not only carbon and nitrogen, but also phosphorus and sulfur, for instance. And so these folks has looked at the end result of the elemental composition of compost, and recognized that by making sure those elements are present up front, we can significantly increase the amount of stable organic matter that's left as a function of making that compost pile. And so now we learn that it's not just a carbon-nitrogen ratio that's important in our compost pile, but it's also making sure that there's enough phosphorus and sulfur in the compost pile as well. And by doing that, we can increase the volume of compost that's left at the end of the game by as much as 7 times. And so there's some papers out there that support this conversation. So the next thing for me is, okay, well, where do I find phosphorus and sulfur rather than going and buying it in the store? Well, if you look in my book, one of my favorite recipes for phosphorus is using cow bones and using vinegar to extract phosphorus out of cow bones. Boom. So now I have a source of phosphorus that I can use. Another one is fermented fish. If you take fish from the ocean and you ferment them, you get a huge complement of not only phosphorus, but also sulfur and, of course, many of the other minerals that are out there. And that data is all in my book. You can look at that as well. So the next thing is, well, where do I find sulfur that makes sense for the backyard gardener? And the answer is sheep's wool. Any hair on the animal's early has large amounts of sulfur in it. So all of a sudden, we're beginning to recognize what's in our backyard to increase the volume of compost that we make and also the compost itself. And so when we make bone broths, I'm sure many of your people understand all about bone broths. Well, what do you do with the bones afterwards? Well, I do several things with them. The first thing I do is I cook them and I make a vinegar extraction. And now I have shelf-stable phosphorus and calcium sources, and of course all the other minerals in there that I use when I talk about phases of influence and actually trying to figure out what plants need during different phases of influence. And then the next thing is I'll use these bones and crush them up and I'll put them in my garden, or I'll put them in my compost pile as source of calcium and phosphorus, which now I recognize are so important to make those stable forms of organic matter.
Well, that's one of the questions I was going to ask you. If you used any animal products in your compost, obviously you're using clamshells and bones and such. And if you had, obviously, if you have any animals, you're probably composting their manure.
Yeah. So as far as manures go, if you use manures exclusively over a long period of time, you're generally going to build up large amounts of phosphorus, which you may or may not be a problem. But also, I tell people that I like to interview the animals before their manure goes on my garden. because I want it. What they're eating is what I'm going to be eating. The other thing is fish is a really great product to put in the
Okay.
garden
Yeah.
compost. And I have a video where I show you how to use whole fish. You can actually take whole fish and put them in your compost pile, and you come back and they're gone. They're long gone pretty relatively quickly, especially if you have a thriving biological community in your compost pile. And then people say, well, what about the local animals that come around and this and that? So this is where another place where rock dusts become very handy.
Okay.
I've visited all of the quarries around me, and I'm able to get rock dust for free from quarries, whether it's a basalt or a lime or a granite, whatever. Those are great sources. And if you throw the fish down on your whole fish, put them down on your compost pile, and then cover them with rock dust, the raccoons, they will come, and they'll be there that night, and they will go into your compost and they will eat one fish. And they recognize that all of that rock on that fish does not taste very good, and they will leave it alone.
Oh, that's a good way to do it. So I was one of the questions I was going to ask you too is how do you source the stuff? You're obviously getting fish from locally since you are in the Northeast, right? Um, and you obviously have quarries nearby. What would you do if you didn't have access to fish?
Well, I think most of us have access to fish. Maybe not seawater fish.
Okay.
And if I was in the Midwest, for instance, then I'd go find a fish market near me
Okay.
and visit that fish market, or I'd go to a restaurant. So I've befriended restaurants, and guess what they do with their oyster shells? Well, first of all, I like oysters. So when I go to a restaurant, I always ask for my oyster shells to go. And they look at me funny and they laugh at
Right.
me things, right? And that's cool. But and then slowly, I might sell mushrooms to the chef because I like to harvest mushrooms and during the year. And then it's like, well, you guys are just throwing this stuff away. If you put it you do your big business on Friday, Saturday. If I come here on a Sunday, maybe I could just take the bucket rather than you throw it away, filled with oyster shells or shrimp shells or whatever foods that they're normally going to throw away, fish parts, whatever it is. And so it's becoming friendly with your butcher, your fish market, your restaurant, and recognizing that they throw an awful lot of very valuable stuff away every day.
Yeah,
And
we
so how
throw
can
so much of our nutrients away.
Exactly. And so how can I get into that loop? How can I close waste gaps by working with some of these people? And we're all people who care. We
Mhm.
all want the right thing. And these ideas, again, they're just so intuitive and they just make so much sense. It's like these are conversations that are really easy to have. Now, it doesn't mean you're going to be successful every time because people do things for a huge number of different reasons. But there's a high probability you're going to find that place down the street that makes breakfast and has God knows how many hundreds of eggs that they break every morning that they throw out, or the butcher, or whatever it is. What's in your backyard? This is the whole question, is realizing that you have an amazing amount of resources, especially here in the United States
Mhm.
and Canada, in your backyard. And how can you utilize them? And how can we start incorporating them into this whole idea of adding nutrient to our soil, adding biological diversity to our soil, because it's a healthy soil that grows a healthy plant that makes for a healthy person.
So when you're collecting all of these eggshells and fish, you're not fermenting all of these into fermented plant juice and vinegars. Probably, I'm assuming that you're composting the rest of that and then putting it on your garden.
Well, so let's talk eggshells for a minute. The question is, how many of you guys had eggshells this morning? How many of you guys had eggs for breakfast this morning?
Right.
Okay, at least half of you raised your hands. All right. And then the next question is, well, what'd you do with the eggshells? And this
Well,
is
I
where
saved mine. Yeah.
so this is where the audience, then the number of hands gets a little smaller. And then I said, well, how many put them on the compost pile? And then, okay, just like, and then the next thing is, well, how many thought of making a vinegar extraction of those eggshells? And the number is very small. And it's merely a fact of taking your eggshells that you had for breakfast, putting them in a toaster oven and cooking them, and then adding vinegar. And then 2 weeks later, you've got a vinegar extraction of eggshells, which has a huge complement of calcium in it, along with many other minerals. And so now, and I would argue that the recipes that I'm talking about, you can make these things in less time than it takes you to get in your car, drive down to the store, buy whatever the heck it is, bring it back, read how many ounces of this and how many ounces. You could have made the stuff. You could have made it for nothing. You could have closed the waste gaps. That's sustainable, right? When you're using your eggshells to make something that you're going to feed your garden, when you're using the plants in your backyard to make something to feed, this is sustainable. All right. When you go and buy something in a store, that is not sustainable.
Yeah. Well, and I actually watched your video on that. So you have a video on doing actually most of the things that you've mentioned so far. You have videos on YouTube, which are super helpful, especially for a visual learner like me. Do you ever, so you were talking about the calcium in this. Do you ever consume any of that yourself?
The easy answer is yes. I mean, there are many herbalists and practitioners that will recommend these as sources of health. Now, I generally don't recommend these things, and I don't usually speak about these things because that takes you into an entire different realm of regulation, if you will.
Oh, yes.
And right. And so the easy answer is, I don't know.
Right. Yeah. This is not a medical podcast. We're not giving medical advice. Yeah. Yes. I understand that completely. So they're completely safe. You're not, because so many people are, some people have been concerned about putting compost on their garden. And I guess I was coming full circle to the fact that this is like completely safe. This is very safe, a lot safer than going and buying chemicals and fertilizer to put on your garden. And it serves a better purpose because you're coming full circle and you're giving you're giving your garden more of what it needs than what you're going to get with, say, your NPK.
It goes strong. It goes further than that. And then now I'm going to go back to the idea of the electrical potential in the soil, the actual charged soil. And when we start thinking about soil as a charged entity, well, let's back up for a minute. As a physicist or an engineer, when approaching a complex system, the first thing you need to understand is what is the energy that drives the system? Right? Second law of thermodynamics. People are going to recognize this. There's no such thing as a free lunch, right? And so what drives the system that we're talking about? What drives the soil ecosystem? What drives the biology in the soil, the transfer of minerals, all the chemical reactions that take place in the soil? And the answer is it's charged. It is an electrical charge that's created by photosynthesis that actually feeds this voltage into the soil. So the next thing is, okay, great. So I've got a voltage in my soil that's running the show. Well, what holds that voltage together? And the answer is the stable organic matter in the soil.
Okay.
The humic substance, and things like that. Okay, great. So now I have a voltage. Now people will recognize that there's got to be a current and a resistance. Well, some people actually measure the electrical conductivity of their soil. And when you measure the electrical conductivity of the soil, you're getting an idea of how this energy flows within your soil. Now, let's go back to the fertilizers and pesticides and all those things like that. One of the things they do is they increase the electrical conductivity of the soil, which increases the current because the voltage stays the same. And so what these things do are actually burning up and using the organic matter in the soil. And so
makes sense. Okay.
They work, but they work at the expense of regenerativeness. Okay, now we're back to the regenerative word. And if you want to regenerate your soil, you need to be increasing the amount of stable carbon and active carbon that's actually going into the system so that it forms the battery that can hold on to the charge that the plant is providing it. And when we use pesticides, herbicides, fungicides, and a lot of chemical fertilizers, most of the stuff that you buy, what you're doing is increasing that electrical conductivity of the soil, and you're burning up the organic matter at the expense of the lack of nutrition that might be there anyway. So when we talk about using fertilizers that you purchase in the store, chemical fertilizers, the first thing is they're not in the form that the soil biology can use. So the soil biology has to convert them into forms that the plant and the soil biology can use. And that takes energy. And where does that energy come from? That's the energy in the soil. And where does that come from? That comes from plants photosynthesizing. And so because we're adding things to the soil that require further processing by the soil ecosystem, then we're burning up not only precious energy that the plants have provided to the soil, but we're also burning up the stable organic matter in the soil in the process as well. And this is again why homemade mineral amendments are so important, because they're already in forms that plants can use, and they're already in proportions that plants can use. When I first started down this road and realized that I needed these 18 minerals, and I started realizing, well, where am I going to find molybdenum? Where am I going to find cobalt, selenium, manganese, right? Never mind pronounce them, right? Where am I going to find them? And then the next thing is, oh, I need 0.5 parts per million cobalt. I need 1 part per million molybdenum. I need 80 parts per million manganese. And it goes on and on and on. And I was dumbfounded by how the heck am I going to find these things? How am I going to sustainably find cobalt, which is mined in South Africa and not necessarily under the greatest conditions, right? So how am I going to find this stuff? And then how the heck am I going to mix it? And so when I did the fermented plant juices and I did the analysis on them and found A, all 18 minerals were there, B, they were in plant proportions, and C, they were already in forms that plants could use directly as foliar sprays or drenches. It was a ding moment. It rang the bell. It's like, why don't people do this all the time? Why isn't this common knowledge?
It's so interesting that you say, why isn't this common knowledge? Because I do feel like this is something that people knew before, and it's something that we have lost. And because of you and others like you, we're regaining it. And one of the things that I wanted to ask you about was, we're taught that, well, at least I was taught that with the soil, we have deficient food now because the soils are deficient. So where is all that when you talk about like Nettles has all 18? So will it still have all 18 even if your soil isn't the best? Like I got Michigan sand here. Will it still somehow find a way to get all 18 of those minerals that we need?
That's a really fun question. The first thing to recognize is that the mineral proportions in plants is different than the mineral proportions in the soil. And this is because plants have the ability to mine minerals in the soil in proportions that they need and want. And they do that by interacting with the soil biology. They actually have the ability to support different bacteria and fungi in the soil. In fact, if you listen to the work of James White, which is fantastic work, he'll point out the fact that the bacteria actually reside in the seed itself and are actually absorbed by the roots and digested by the plant and then released into the soil through the root hairs to do further mining. In fact, the release of bacteria through the root hairs of the plant actually extends the root hairs so that the bacteria are released into a new area of soil that it can then digest and then be absorbed through the root and then digested by the plant. So once we start recognizing this amazing cycling of nutrient, we recognize how important the soil biology is and how important these processes are.
That is, I mean, and that's also why it's so important to not continually till because you're interrupting those messengers, right?
Well, so yeah, right. So if we look at land that has been tilled for generations, in some cases, huge tracts of land, well, okay, so what do? They till it. What does that do? Well, first of all the mycelium strands are going to be chopped up and blown away. All of the community, the interest, the sites within the soil, all of that ecology, that structure in the soil is going to be disrupted significantly. So the bacteria is going to be tossed around and all of the stuff's been mixed up. The worst part, though, is that you're exposing that soil to the sun, okay? And it's going to dry out, all right? So now I've got mixed up, killed, dried out stuff. Well, what kind of biological community is going to survive in that environment? And then you do it time after time, multiple times a year, and then you leave it bare. Well, you don't have a biological community that's thriving in that situation. And now we start talking about the generational effects of that and how we're actually eliminating those biologies from those soils, never mind killing them one time over.
Yeah. I mean, and this is why we're getting all of these. I believe this is why we have started experiencing an increase in all of these health issues that you see in people and in animals, and then we have all of the issues environmentally that this is causing as well. So, yeah. So
there's a rabbit hole.
Yeah. So one of the things that you talk about is you're making these and sending these away to a lab. Now, you have tables in your book and on your website that show all of this research. Where are you sending these to? And then do you encourage people to get soil tests the first time before they start a garden, yearly?
Yeah. So I think laboratory testing is very, very important because people need to see the data. I've said that for my entire career. Show me the data, right? Talk's cheap. Show me the data. And so I definitely encourage data as the driving principle for why you do things. And so you mentioned a soil test. Let's talk about a soil test. Yes, I recommend that people do a soil test at least once, right? Because who knows what's in the soil where you're growing? And the answer is you don't. And so you might as well do a soil test. And the value of a soil test, there are many reasons why to do a soil test. But if you've been growing on the same land, or if that land has been farmed or gardened for some period of time, one of the main reasons you want to do a soil test is to figure out the excesses in the soil, not the deficiencies, but the excesses.
Okay.
For instance, if you've been adding NPK to your soil year after year after year, well, guess what? You probably have too much P and K, and the nitrogen is probably leaching out into your neighbors or into the water or something like that. That would be a good thing to know. If you've been doing the same gardening practices in the same land for a long time, there's a good probability that you have excesses, and that translates into saving money, right? Don't do that anymore. Don't pay for that product anymore. The other value is to try and figure out things like the calcium ratio, the calcium magnesium ratio of your soil, which is really important for soil tilth. Calcium wants to be about 68% and magnesium about 13%. And the reason for that is the calcium molecule is a very big molecule and the magnesium molecule is a relatively smaller molecule. And the standard example is imagine a room full of people and 68% were calcium and 13% were magnesium. And all the guys that were calcium had their arms spread out as wide as they could and were spinning. Well, look how much space that calcium person's going to take up, where the magnesium person has their arms by their side. And it doesn't matter if you're spinning or not. You got your arms by your side, and you're still only going to take up a very small amount of space. And so if your calcium magnesium ratio is not right, then that is setting up soil tilth. That's the gas exchange and the amount of water and gas that's actually getting into your soil. So there's another reason for a soil test.
So the other thing shows that the ratio.
Yes, the soil.
Get a good soil test.
Exactly. It should give you calcium magnesium ratios. The other thing is it's going to show you whether or not you're short on important elements like sulfur, silicon, boron, and some other things. So I highly recommend doing a soil test. They're only like $35 or something like that. And then the next thing is, well, where and what kind of soil test do you want? There are a whole bunch of soil tests out there. The key is to make sure that all of the minerals that you want are going to be evaluated in that soil test. And I have a section on soil tests in the book, and there's also a section of the desired proportions of minerals that are wanted in there. And when you do a soil test, I recommend that you make sure that all of those minerals are being evaluated by your soil test. You also, I think exchange capacity is a very good one to have in your soil tests. Electrical conductivity is a good one. Percent organic matter is a good one. And so I recommend becoming familiar with a lab, become comfortable with a lab, call them up, have conversations with them. You know, what do you do? How long have you been doing this? You guys staying in business for a while? Because as you go through your life, especially if you're going to be a gardener on the same plot of land for 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 years, then having a soil test done by the same lab when you do want to do one later on to understand the changes that have taken place, that consistency is very important. Anytime in any kind of measurement, data measurement thing, you want to eliminate sources of variation. And by using the same lab over and over again, you eliminate the source of variation between labs, which could be a very big one.
That's such a great point. That makes so much sense. So getting back to these amendments that you're making and so you're going to be testing your soil and you're going to be figuring out what you have too much of, and then you're going to be sourcing locally. How long does it take on average to make some of these amendments that you're using? Is it something that I should have started last fall, or is it something I could start now to use this summer type of thing?
Well, for those of you who are financially whiz inclined, when's the best time to start a retirement account? Well, it was back when you were 20 years old, right? Well, what's the second best time? Now, right? And so it's the same thing. These things that we're talking about are not silver bullets. They're not something that you do once and you're done. These are things that are ways of life. We are talking about how we're going to go forward in life over the long run. And so right now, here we are in North America. It's wintertime, and those of us that are in the north of North America, it's pretty darn cold outside. In fact, my soil temperatures just became over 32 degrees, just moving into the high 30s in some of my gardens right now, and things are just starting to grow. In fact, I harvested my first cup of stinging nettle tea this morning from the nettle that's outside. So right now, it's very difficult to make fermented plant juices because there's nothing really out there to make them. But I could be making vinegar extractions. It's very easy to get those eggshells, cook them up, grab some vinegar, and make some vinegar extractions and start making shelf-stable products that you'll be using throughout the growing season. And so, as soon as those first weeds come up in the springtime, the nettle, if you're not going to drink it for tea or dehydrate it for tea later in the year, you could make a fermented plant juice of that. Maybe the dandelions are actually, the dandelions in my hoop house are up right now. And so I could be making fermented plant juice of dandelions. So you do it. What you're going to do is learn that there are annual processes. There are things that you're going to do throughout the year for all of these kinds of things. Just like you put your tomatoes in the ground at the end of May or the beginning of June. You know, that's when you do tomatoes. So these are things that you're going to learn to do as part of your normal growing strategies.
Okay. So say you're a little overwhelmed by this, like I was when I first started reading the book. And now that I'm watching your videos, it's a lot easier. But are there people that actually sell any of these amendments? Or I know that is definitely not a closed loop system, but if someone wanted to get started.
So I don't know anybody that sells these things. And one of the problems with selling things like this is you have to deal with the bureaucracy that exists in our country.
True.
And then the labeling, and then picking what you're going to call it, and then all of the stuff that goes along with that stuff. And so my argument is it's way too easy to make yourself. And why rely on anybody else? to me, again, it is overwhelming. By the way, I am a fire hose to a lot of people. And the thing to recognize is that um, you start doing these things. In fact, in my book, I have a couple pages where it's where do I start? There's a couple pages as how do I start, and short term and long term things to do, if you will. And the important thing I think for me is that the mere fact that you're listening to this is you've already started. You're already on the road.
Yeah.
The mere fact that you're growing your own food, that you're even thinking about growing your own food, is you're on a roll. And I like to talk about all kinds of stuff. But the bottom line is there were years where I rototilled my garden, put the seed in the ground, and I grew some really great tomatoes. All right. And so the thing is to not get hung up on, oh my God, what should I be doing? That's the wrong mentality. The mentality is, isn't it great to be working with nature and eating this lovely bounty from my garden? How lucky are we to be able to do that? And recognizing that this year's crop might not be as good as next year's crop because of the recognition that we are improving the soil organic matter, the recognition that we are increasing the biological diversity in the ground, the recognition that we are saving our own seeds, and the seeds are getting healthier and better as a result of us saving them rather than buying the same lousy seeds that were purchased year after year after year. And so these are commentaries about slow change. No silver bullets in life. Only in the American advertising system is there a silver bullet. And so what we're doing here is we're talking about a way of life, and we're talking about nurturing that way of life and working with nature as we go forward, and enjoying the bounty of the blueberries that we grow, or the potatoes, or the carrots, or the tomatoes, or whatever the heck it is.
I love that so much. Everything you just said, I just love it. It's baby steps and slow forward movements. So one of the videos I watched, if we're talking to maybe somebody new or you want to start new beds, was your two videos that you had on starting new beds, and then you planted potatoes in there. And so one of the questions I had about that was, you were using hay instead of straw. And I wondered if there was a reason behind why you used hay instead of straw. And then if you don't have hay or straw, I'm assuming that you can use leaves. So I wanted to talk maybe a little bit about that process. Obviously, people can go watch your video on YouTube about the process of starting just from scratch, like your new beds.
Right. So when you start a garden, the way I always used to start a garden is you beat the crap out of it. You rototilled it. You turned it all up, and you killed all the biology, and you got rid of all the moisture and let it dry out, and then you started planting stuff. Well, as soon as we start thinking about the requirement for biological diversity and maintaining the biology in the soil, that idea quickly becomes obsolete. And so we need a new way to do it. And so, so I start a garden by putting down about 12 inches of hay on the grass in the fall, and I plant in May. It's as simple as that. Now, I might add minerals, I might add biology, I might add fermented plant juices in order to make that system even better still. But so what am I doing? I am not disrupting all of the soil structure that's there. I'm not destroying the biology in the soil that's there. What I'm doing is really breaking down the grass and the roots in that system. And by doing that, I'm adding carbon into the soil. I'm taking those carbons and I'm killing them, and then adding them directly into the soil. All those roots, they're going to stay in the soil and become part of the soil carbon, organic matter, structure stuff, right? So then you talk about hay, straw, and leaves. Hay is cheap. If you have to go buy an organic matter, hay is probably one of the cheapest, most available things to a lot of us here in North America. And so that's what I use. Now, a lot of people say, well, it's got seeds in it. I say, so what? So what? So some of that hay is going to grow? Cool. Now I've got a cover crop.
Okay. That makes sense. I mean, it's easy. I love it.
And if I don't like it, I just cut it and I leave the roots in the ground and it falls. And now I've got a mulch and I've got roots in the ground, which is more organic matter.
Okay.
And by the way, that generally doesn't happen. What happens is with that 12 inches, normally it breaks down, and the seeds, they go away. They don't grow. Now, some will, but my experience is a very small amount will grow. So let's talk about straw. Why would anybody use straw? You've eliminated the seed head, which is some of the most nutritious part of the plant. And I'm left with the stubble. I don't want stubble. I want as much organic matter as I possibly can. If you think about a carbon budget, oh, I
That,
don't deal with straw.
okay.
I,
That makes sense. That makes so much more sense. And now I think I'm going to be buying hay instead of straw.
well,
So
and the
we
next
have
thing is
lots of,
leaves.
yeah, as I say, I have tons and tons of leaves.
Can't beat it. Of all three of them, leaves, crushed leaves are the top of that pyramid. Why? One, because they've got much more nutrient in them than the straw or the hay. Two, they've got a lot of biology on them. If they're alive, and even when they die, there's still some biology on there. And then three, their carbon nitrogen ratio is nicer, 30 to 1 or something like that, as
Okay.
opposed to something higher. And then four, they break down a lot quicker if you mow them before you put them on the soil. So now you're getting that active layer of carbon on the soil really quickly. And that's going to break down very quickly. And there's a lot of critters in the soil that really like leaves. And so crushed leaves, in my opinion, is a gold standard in mulch.
And they're so free. At least where
They're
I
so,
am, they're free.
yeah, I'll
That
throw them
is
out.
that is amazing. I feel like you said, I feel like I've drank from a fire hose and um I could ask you so many questions and just sit here and learn forever, but I want to respect your time. And I wanted to tell people that you do have a wonderful website, a great YouTube. You have your book. You also have some classes that you said you run once a year. Do you want to tell us a little bit about the classes that you do and about your website and YouTube?
Yeah, I have a website and YouTube, and YouTube is free. I haven't put anything up there for a bit, but I'm about to start putting some more stuff on there. I have been enjoying the conversations with a gentleman by the name of Olivier Houssan, who is the person that has brought the idea of redox potential, the idea of a voltage in the soil to my eyes, and is just doing absolutely amazing work. That's another name that I recommend. There are three
Okay.
people out in Olivier Houssan, James for learning about energy in the soil, electrical potentials in the soil. James White for Rutgers University for learning about bacteria and fungi actually within seeds and within plants and responsible for 70 to 80% of the nutrition that plants use. In fact, there's a discussion between John Kempf and James White
Ooh,
in the
I love
March
John Kemp.
issue of this Acres USA magazine that will
Okay.
bend anybody's mind. And then the third person is Gerald Pollack, the fourth phase of water. His work is absolutely revolutionizing our concepts of water and some of the flow of energy in plant sap, blood, and a lot of other things. So yeah, what was we talking about? Oh, website. Yeah, so I got a website. Check it out. I'm just about to update my website, and I think the most important thing on my website is this idea, trying to document the mineral composition of fermented plant juices and vinegar extractions. And I invite people from all over the world to participate in this endeavor. I use Logan Labs as a laboratory for analysis. I've spent a lot of time looking around and finding a lab that will do the analysis that's pertinent as well as at a cost that's reasonable. And anybody that's interested in contributing to that database may do so on my website. You can call me, talk to me. I'm a very approachable person. I actually answer my email and things like that. So that's my website. What else was there? Oh yeah, I do offer a class. I offer a 5-part class once a year, and it's thick. It is dense, but it talks about all of these ideas. And in my opinion, these are the ideas are fundamental. If we don't understand the energy flow in the soil and the relationship between plants and the soil biology, it's very difficult to understand how we're going to be sustainable and how we're going to regenerate the soil. Unless we understand the ecosystem, we have a difficult time understanding the effects of our interactions. We as gardeners or growers, we influence the soil. We are perturbing the soil ecosystem. And it's very important to understand the effects of our actions. What are the ramifications of your actions when you go and do something in your. And it's these sorts of conversations and these sorts of understandings that allow us to then make rational decisions about the cost benefit analysis of rototilling. Let's face it, sometimes you got to rototill your garden, some people think, right? And they have a darn good reason for thinking that. And it might be because of all kinds of different things, whether it's financial, manpower, time, whatever it might be. But let's understand when you do that, these are the things that are going to take place. And then you need to remediate that somehow. So I offer a 5-part program. I offer it once a year, generally. In fact, the class number 4 is tomorrow. So the class is almost done. I am recording that class. I'm considering making it an on-demand class on my. So stay tuned for that. That's pretty well it. That's probably enough.
Yeah.
That
Well,
kind of thing.
so I will try to find those names of those 3 people and put them in the links. The It's just so fascinating. I could sit here and listen to you talk for hours about all of this because I have learned so much, and I'm so thankful for your generous gift of time to our listeners and to myself to answer all of my questions. I will put links to your website and your book and your YouTube channel in the show notes. And that's it. Do you have anything to say before we close?
Thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you for taking the time to listen to this podcast. And I'm just really grateful that there are so many people that are interested in these ideas. And I look forward to hearing about any successes that we have that are simple and I guess the easiest thing to do is take your shoes off, get in your garden, and be thankful.
I love it. And with that, I will end with how I always end the podcast, which is grow where you're planted.